Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for all the steering committee and presenters for being with us here. We had a very, very full day yesterday of evocative discussions. And, one of the points that I wanted to go back to, it was very interesting during the presentations, we were talking about how challenging the image quality was. The NLST, we had an analysis from Dr. Jerome Potnikal that the technical inadequacy of many of the images was quite significant. And I think we want to clarify that this is the fault line that we exist on, because the NLST was designed for radiological interpretation. And they had very good quality control and probably the best technical evaluation of any major imaging trial, screening trial for certain built into that. However, it's for visual evaluation. And what we do is quantitative analysis. And the requirements for quantitative analysis are fundamentally different than required for visual. Quantitative being a much higher lift. And so when we're talking about all these things, we're applying prospectively now this quantitative prism, which sets a new level of work. In routine clinical activities in a radiology department, 99.9% of what they do is not quantitative. And so we think that moving forward, given where the machines are and the instruments are in terms of what's possible, the computer power we now have at our disposal, quantitative assessment is going to give us much fuller information, especially in regard to this opportunity that we heard about in various presentations yesterday of looking at change over time. And the change over time, we heard, could be the most powerful biomarker. And we could look at change over time for virtually any one of the modalities that we're talking about. So that has not been vetted as a reliable biomarker outside of what we heard yesterday. And that's what we're going to be focusing on moving forward. Now, today, we have a relatively brief program, but power-packed. We have 3 presentations, just 3 different sessions, and they'll be led by the groups that we discussed yesterday. And we'll get right to the first one. And then after that, we'll kind of try to bring together the disparate strains of ideas that occurred in the breakout groups yesterday afternoon. And we'll try to work that into some kind of cohesive idea about priorities and action plans to implement in the ensuing year. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our chairs for the next session. Dr. Bruce Pyenson and Anita McLaughlin.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm Bruce Pyenson, and I'm an actuary that's worked in the healthcare industry for about 40 years, most of that as a consultant to various industries in healthcare. Our topic is a bit different than the other wonderfully technical and clinical topics of the rest of the QIW. This morning, we're going to talk about lessons from industry in promoting this breakthrough technology of thoracic screening. Just to define that a little bit in advance, when I say lessons from industry, I'm talking about how the medical technology, the life sciences industry, pharmaceutical industry prepares ahead of time to get acceptance of new products, of new technologies. And as Jim has said wonderfully, the CT scanning of the thorax is a very rare gift to medicine. It's something that has a profound impact across a number of disease states. And the realization of that is really a breakthrough, and it really shakes up a lot of the silos that exists in medicine and healthcare today. It'll have to shake it up if that potential is going to get realized. What drove me to want to talk about this today and the rest of the panelists is the really slow progress of that we've had. Sorry, the slow progress we've had in the adoption of CT scanning, not just the 30-year history of development of evidence to reach the point today, but for the last 10 years, CT scanning, lung cancer screening has been recognized and adopted, but the take-up is dismally low, as we've discussed. So the pharmaceutical industry, the medical technology industry, makes sure that they don't face those delays, because that would be a financial catastrophe for them. So I think there's some lessons from industry and also from other areas in healthcare. It strikes me that in this group we have advocates, we've got people from industry, but we also have a lot of researchers. And I think even among researchers, we can identify the barriers that we're facing and take proactive steps to shortcut the tedious process that we've had to go through. So could I have the next slide, please? You know, it strikes me that, and I've been guilty of this as well. For example, we just published a paper on lung cancer screening in Poland. You know, the costs, the benefits of implementing lung cancer screening across Poland. In the discussion section, I should have talked about integrated thoracic health screening. And I should have talked about it from the standpoint of saying, hey, this is coming in the future. And even if I just said that and we didn't evaluate it, you know, but those are potential upsides, just to get readers and regulators and scientists, others, public health people used to the idea. So I'm thinking that in just about everything we do, the individuals in this group do and publish and talk about, we should introduce that concept of what's coming and get people used to that idea. So I think one of the big barriers that we all face, there's a lot of barriers, but one of them is just getting people used to the idea of something new. And you know, my point up there is that evidence development is just not sufficient. Often people dealing with the difficult scientific and evidence issues try to focus on that justifiably, but that's not sufficient, as we've seen. Can I have the next slide, please? So here's an ad, illustrates my point. I plucked it off my internet feed. It's about lipoprotein A, and you know, I didn't pick this ad because it has anything, you know, because it's related to cardiology. So for the folks interested in cardiology in the room, this isn't about challenging coronary calcium or alternatives or risk scoring or anything else. It's just an ad that's out there. Lipoprotein A is apparently a major risk factor for coronary artery disease, for heart disease, and 1 in 5 people have it. It's inherited.
there's no therapy for it. Not yet. Why is there an ad? I mean, and you can tell it's a farm ad. I mean, you look at the blood splash there, and there's really a character, sort of, maybe it's subliminal. I didn't notice it until I put it on the slide here. You know, so this is clearly a pharma ad, and this one is aimed at healthcare professionals. So I lied and I said I was a healthcare professional, so I could read it. I'm an actuary now, but so why is this out there? You know, and well, I think folks can guess. There's no therapy for LPA yet, and it doesn't respond to changes in lifestyle or, you know, wellness or diet, exercise, or anything like that. But there's maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 companies that are developing products for it. Let's go to the next slide. And you can tell this is a farm ad because there's these happy people off in the right, and you know, and again, it's 1 in 5
multiracial, yeah.
multiracial, and
You can tell.
and you know, they're happy and they're doing something, you know, on the beach and stuff, and this one is for the public. So why is it that someone is buying ads for drugs that haven't even been approved yet for a condition? It's not branded. You know, there's no brand. You have to dig a bit to figure out who's funding this. And so one ad directed at healthcare professionals, cardiology, right, to get them aware of the you know, the risks. So when obviously when the drug comes out, if the drug gets approved and cardiologists don't know about it and nobody's been tested for it, the drug's not going to, the take-up is going to get delayed and be slow. So this is, I think, an example of preparing the market for something to come, preparing professionals, preparing people at risk, and to shortcut the process, because excuse me, if people get tested now, obviously that's going to accelerate the uptake of the drug. So this is I think a little lesson. I can sort of hear some of the advocates of coronary calcium scoring, you know, thinking about, well, is this such an important risk factor? That's not my point here. Let's go to the next slide. So some of the other obstacles, you know, obviously there's no drug yet. High risk individuals are unaware. Primary care doesn't know about this. They're not thinking about lipoprotein A because there's no drug. Cardiology is not engaged. There's no insurance coverage. Of course not. There's no drug to cover. And it turns out there's actually differing test metrics out there for LPA. So there's a whole bunch of obstacles that the industry has identified, and these ads are just part of the process. I mean, it's possible none of those drugs will even get approved. But I think we're much more optimistic in this group about the potential for the integrated thoracic screening. So obviously we don't have the capital that industry has to promote something, but I think there's lessons here. So next slide, please. Now, before I get the panel to introduce itself, I want to suggest a couple of things we can start to do now so that we don't have to wait another 30 years to take advantage of what Jim has called the Swiss Army knife of medicine. Identify the obstacles, start to address them, recognize that evidence is not sufficient, and that it takes time for people to get used to this idea, especially because we are really breaking some silos across the medical specialties, across diagnostics, across the approval process for screening. How the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force might want another NLST except for coronary calcium or for early detection of COPD. So my recommendation is use every opportunity to mention the combined thoracic screening, even if it's just in the concept that there's potential and it needs to be explored. We've got to get people used to that idea much more broadly than it is today. There's challenges, there's evidence, there's quality metrics, there's outcome metrics. So all these things need to be developed. Let's get that discussion out there and going even before we have the evidence. Next slide, please. So terrific panel, and we've got Cheryl Hilton, who's been a leader in breaking silos in many areas, and she was an activist in the early days of HIV/AIDS, and perhaps more relevant to what we're going to be talking about, she was a leader in the anti-smoking movement. And we've got Anita McLaughlin, who's at the GoTo Foundation and was active in the efforts to expand lung cancer screening eligibility. Got Matt Cham, who's a radiologist and a leader in cardiac coronary scanning, and is actually also a leader in educating radiologists, which I'm going to ask him about. And Morton Agabi, who's been struggling with various regulators. So so I'm gonna start. Cheryl, guys, if you could limit your comments to 5 minutes, maybe 7 minutes, and we'll try to move this along. And what are the lessons from each of you? I'll turn it over to Cheryl. If you could introduce yourself as well.
Muted.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, Bruce. I am a professor of public health policy at NYU. I was the founding dean of the School of Global Public Health there that began back in 2012. And I was the founding CEO of the Legacy Foundation, which was the foundation created by the attorneys generals when they sued the tobacco industry. It was a foundation created to advance the public health agenda of reducing smoking in the United States. So I will be very crisp in my remarks, and I'll start with, and I apologize, I'm on 57th Street. You'll hear a few horns in the background, and heaven forbid, maybe even a fire engine. There's not much I can do about it. I'd like to begin with the moonshot announcement that occurred, as many of you know, back when Joe Biden was vice president and around the time that his son was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. That proposal was released to much fanfare and very much felt like the earlier war on cancer. And what was wonderful about it is things like that create enormous momentum, and you can ride the momentum. What was missing from that, unfortunately, and what in an article in Lancet, a large array of public health leaders raised, was the absence of any discussion about how to implement primary prevention of cancer, as well as secondary prevention interventions, which of course is partially what this panel is about, and what the combined thoracic screening really is about as it relates to lung disease, anything that's carcinogenic. So they failed to prioritize public health and innovative research and actions that can bend the curve on cancer morbidity and mortality. And I would just repeat that because I've said it before in these forums that Jim and Bruce and others have put together, and David. we need to make the case for this triple screening. Let's call it triple screening for now. It could be quadruple screening. We need to make the case for what in its absence would be the morbidity and mortality, and what in its presence would it be. I think you have to make a very high level public health case for it, because interventions around radiology are not generally viewed as public health strategies, and yet they are more and more legitimate and appropriate public health strategies. And this particular strategy has a multiplier effect, which greatly increases the potential efficiency, which is the new buzzword under the current leadership, and heaven forbid our soon-to-be HHS leader who does not believe in vaccines. But we have our work cut out for us trying to innovate, but there's an overt commitment to innovation and efficiency. So this may be the way that for the next few years, this has to be packaged. The other concern about the moonshot, as it was described, is it didn't focus enough on implementation science research, which allows us to figure out, we know what works, how can we scale it up? And as Bruce just said, what are the barriers and how can they be knocked down? This is not an easy lift. And here's where I think both AIDS and smoking, tobacco use, and even COVID are examples of problems that the country woke up and said the leading behavioral cause of death in the United States is smoking. That led to a whole host of activities that ultimately drastically reduced the level of smoking in our country and in most industrialized nations around the world, and also elsewhere as well. But it did not happen overnight, and literally tens of millions of lives were lost while we waited for it to happen. The second, so first there's primary prevention, which is avoiding a problem from ever happening. And then what you're talking about here today, which is secondary prevention through screening, wanting to avoid 3, possibly 4, if liver imaging is involved, potential constellations of diseases that are actionable and for whom the individual impact would potentially be greatly lessened by appropriate intervention, both clinical intervention as well as health education intervention and various treatments as they relate to smoking or alcohol or other cofactors, including diet. It's quite clear that this is an efficient methodology, but I think making the public health case for it has not yet happened. And I think without the public health case, it will be hard to get it broadly disseminated, because you have to succeed in convincing multiple bodies. You have to, 1, convince consumers they need it. You have to, 2, convince policymakers at all levels, state, insurance regulators, CMS, frankly, Congress, that this is a good thing to do. And I think the process of convincing people that it's a good thing to do is in many respects kind of like what Bruce was just presenting, that the pharmaceutical industry does. Just because you get the conversation going, people start thinking about it. When you start saying whatever the number is, 100,000 Americans could be saved each year if there was universal blah, 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 fill in the blank. We don't have those sound bites yet, which can capture consumers, the people who love the consumers who are smokers or have other cofactors like poor diet, obesity, etc. Policymakers who really aren't thinking about this at all. They don't know anything about this at this point. So begin that conversation with policy members at all levels, and providers, because as you've pointed out many, many times, Jim, we live in these silos within the clinical specialties, and bringing those silos together to find a way to work together to make this happen and make this be the standard of care will, I think, be a heavy lift. Certainly, it's cost effective. Certainly, it saves lives. And so it's hard to imagine what the intellectual barrier really would be. And yet it's always hard to innovate. And I think smoking is a great example where really in a period of about 20 years, Policies were changed everywhere. Prices were changed. Clean air laws were changed. Cessation services coverage was vastly expanded. And ironically, probably most important, mass public education was undertaken. In the foundation that I led, we spent between $100 and $150 million a year to convince young people not to start smoking and to urge people who did smoke to try to quit. And so I would not leave out litigation. We talked a little bit at a meeting recently at the New York Academy of Medicine about where will be the tipping point when there is liability for the provider for failing to do secondary prevention activities that are known to be efficacious. The most obvious one being lung cancer screening, where someone who's in regular routine care is diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, who 2 years ago would not have had that, and they were not referred for screening despite falling within the guideline. So more and more, the legal community is waking up to this as an opportunity. And I could imagine the day when the attorneys general would wake up to it as an opportunity. I will note that the ad that you showed, Bruce, from the pharmaceutical industry of the young people on the beach looks almost exactly like Lorelard's Newport brand ad. Their motto was "Alive with Pleasure," despite the fact that their product made people dead as a doornail. So the last comment I will make, because I'm going to stick to the time, is just to say that when AIDS burst on the scene in the United States, with San Francisco and New York as epicenters and ultimately the entire nation being impacted by it, nothing short of what actually happened, the Ryan White Care Act, which is a similar approach that happened with COVID, was able to accelerate all of the things I was just talking about simultaneously. Policy change, research change, practices changes, the education of health professionals very broadly, mass public education. All of those things required an influx of money and a new systems approach to addressing the problems. And that began before antiretrovirals were found to be effective. And once they were found to be effective, that national infrastructure allowed a very broad swath of primary care providers to become able to effectively manage HIV infection and ultimately AIDS as it unfolded in people, as well as public health leaders to manage the messaging and the primary prevention in very complex populations of HIV AIDS. So I think there are lessons from tobacco, there are lessons from AIDS, there are frankly lessons from our recent experience with COVID that in fact it might be worth putting together a small think tank to just sort that through and say, what does that tell us about how we should approach this opportunity? But I will close by saying the single most important thing with respect to the opportunity is to lay out the opportunity cost of not doing it and the advantage to society, our society in the United States, or wherever you can make the case because you have researchers and activities in place to support it. Make that case. And I don't think if you don't make that case, I don't imagine that this will happen quickly. I think there's a way to create a sense of urgency and make the case simultaneously. You can even propose legislation around it. Why not? Because all it can do is not happen. Very often legislation gets bipartisan support, small amount of bipartisan support, and then before you know it, 5 years later, it's passed because it becomes a great idea, even though it didn't really take off at first. So just something to think about. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you very much, Cheryl. It's always inspiring to hear you talk, and you certainly laid out the ambitious goals for us. I'm going to ask Anita McLaughlin to talk about her experience recently in getting the criteria for lung cancer screening expanded, and how that was identified as a challenge and how activities succeeded there. Took some time, but it worked. Anita? And if you could introduce yourself first.
Anita McLaughlin, I'm Senior Director with GoTo for Lung Cancer. We're a patient advocacy organization, really out there fighting the good fight for the lung cancer community, and our mission overall mission is to increase survivorship. I've been working in the lung cancer space for a long time, currently, of course, with patient advocacy And in my prior role with the American College of Radiology, so I've been doing this, I would say, even early on with the first coverage decision, back in 2013 with the USPSTF and so on. I'll touch on some of the major milestones today. But, a lot has taken place in advocacy. Let me get the mic checker. A lot's taken place in advocacy and policy to get to where we're at today. Some of those milestones that have occurred, it all kind of goes hand in hand. So from clinical trials to practice guidelines and advocacy, all which are key drivers in policy, and those partnerships and efforts combined help accelerate policy implementation for our community. So when you consider and start looking at the timeline and which policy decisions are being made for screening and reimbursement, you kind of see it line up clearly with the role of advocacy and policy. And I'll kind of just go over some of the history on some of the major milestones with some of the research and science. ILCAP, of course, published remarkable findings in Lancet in 1999. And LST, we all are familiar with these, I'm sure, but they published in 2011. The USPSTF came out with their grade B recommendation for low-dose CT lung cancer screening at the very tail end of 2013. But prior to that, there was a lot of work to get there. So NCCN had published their screening guidelines. The American College of Radiology were really leaders in developing practice guidelines and standards, standardized protocols like lung RADS, and then also the lung cancer screening data registry. ILCAP, as pioneers, paved the path for screening, and excuse me, all these areas led up to the USPSTF December 2013 recommendation. Following the task force, GO2, at that time we were called Lung Cancer Alliance, recommended that CMS open a national coverage decision. This led to a joint society effort, including the American College of Radiology and the Society of Thoracic Surgeons. It resulted in a positive national coverage decision in 2015 for the Medicare population. And then, as you probably recall with Science and Research, the Nelson published their study in 2020. And the joint societies, we kind of re-engaged, combined efforts again in advocacy that eventually led to the task force expansion of their screening criteria and updated recommendation in 2021. CMS followed with an updated national coverage decision in 2022. And, I'm kind of like flying through these milestones and steps, but none of these policy decisions were easy to achieve. And it did require a major effort between these key groups and partnerships. And again, kind of how that patient advocacy effort layers in with science and research, medical professional societies, and so on. It really did help. And that's why we saw that change or update in 2021 and 22 with lowering of the screening start age and PAC years with smoking history. Most of you all know, but the end of last year, the American Cancer Society published an updated guideline that came out around November of last year. They recommended the removal of the 15 quit smoke year threshold. NCCN guidelines, over a decade, that's been their position, where they do not recommend the quit smoke year threshold. They also do not include an upper age limit. And again, this has been in place for quite some time by NCCN, who's pretty progressive and review their guidelines on an annual basis. Efforts are currently underway by these key joint societies to expand screening criteria by removing the 15-year quit date threshold and also that upper age limit restriction. We did submit a formal comment to both the USPSTF and CMS earlier this year in June. We're continuing to work with these agencies to simplify the inclusion criteria and address the additional at-risk population. We did hold a meeting with CMS's coverage and analysis group and understand that the NCD process, or the national coverage determination, even though they received our request to reopen or reconsider the existing NCD, they basically are saying that it would be triggered following the USPSTF's review. We've also been following up with the task force to find out where where they're at in the review process or in their cycle. Typically, they're on a 5-year review cycle. So the last publication came out in 2022. And so we're still waiting, of course, for that 5-year to occur. And we've asked for an expedited review. That's what our request is. The task force did respond. They said that the topic nomination was accepted, but that they also have a topic prioritization work group that'll be reviewing our request sometime this month. They meet a couple times a year, and so November is on their docket. So stay tuned. We should know more very soon now that we're in mid-November. And, it really does, takes an army, right, with science and research, and then all these major drivers of policy. Patient advocacy is a significant voice in helping shape implementation with that persistency, right? And it really does help move in the right direction and getting close to right or getting it better with for the patient community, for patient access to care. And really those levers of coverage and reimbursement is so impactful for both the provider and the patient-facing groups.
A question, Anita, to what extent has the coalition of advocacy and professional societies been put on notice about triple, quadruple screening?
To what extent have the coalitions been involved? I know that for patient advocacy, there's members. Yesterday, we heard Dr. Ella Cazzaroni speak here. So she definitely is aware, and she works very closely with the American College of Radiology. We've got Matt Sham here as well, as a member of ACR. So there's at some level key leaders that understand the space of a combined approach. How far along are we in that process? I think we're very early still.
Well, thank you very much. Your experience here is really very, very helpful for the discussion. I want to call on Matt on the role of education of physicians. You're involved with American College of Radiology and their process of it. I guess it's the in the process of qualifying exams for radiology, or is it continuing education, or both?
Sure. Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. Go ahead. Yep.
And the question in particular, can we introduce into that now the issue of the concepts of triple, quadruple screening to accelerate that process, so we don't wait until we get something recognized by the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force and then start the process?
Sure. Absolutely. So a lot of that is already going on, I think, within radiology. So if we look at our lung cancer screening reports, we'll almost always talk about the severity of emphysema, the severity of coronary artery disease. So that part of the radiologist's responsibility is already there. I don't think it needs further education. The part that does need more education is translating the findings to actual recommendations that are actionable. So I'm just going to share.
Matt, I'm sorry, I should have asked you to introduce yourself first.
Sure. My name is Matt Sham. I am a cardiothoracic radiologist here at the University of Washington. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to present this important information to the group. I'm just going to share my screen right now. Hopefully people see this slide, which is basically a table from the coronary artery calcification data reporting system. And what it shows is are the 4 different categories of coronary artery calcification, ranging from 0, mild calcification, to severe calcification. And we can quantify it in many different ways. We can use the Agatston scoring, which is typically what's used for ECG-gated scans. Now we're able to somewhat replicate this on non-ECG-gated CT scans. We also have a visual score, which is more of a subjective qualitative measurement as opposed to quantitative. And these correlate to either no calcification or mildly increased calcification or severely increased calcification. And year after year, study after study has always shown that the less calcium you have, the better off you are, and the more calcium you have, the worse you are in terms of risk of cardiac events in the future. So on every single lung screening CT that we do report whether the patient has no calcium or mild, moderate, severe. The only thing that we have not done yet is provide treatment recommendations. And I think this is a very important step that many radiologists are afraid to do. I might be the only one in my group that's doing this actively. I will say actually consider statin therapy, but most of my colleagues are a little bit less comfortable, I think, because they've been too far from medical school. In other words, when we were medical students, we would, write prescription medications, and prescribing drugs was something that we did on a daily basis. But once you transition into the radiology realm, where your primary expertise is image interpretation, you become more distant from that medical student role of prescribing medications, and then you defer that medication recommendation to the other providers, for example, cardiologists or family medicine practitioners. And so this has not thus far been in our lung cancer screening reports. That being said, can we just easily convert it? Can we convert mildly increase the, statin therapy and severely increase the higher intensity statin therapy? Absolutely, we can do that. In fact, we already do that for our dedicated cardiac calcium score scans. In other words, when we scan only the hearts for calcium score specifically, we do recommend statin therapies for these different categories. So we do that routinely for cardiac imaging, but for lung screening, somehow it hasn't really happened that way. There are several barriers to this. I think one of the key issues is some of the radiologists are hesitant because they might think, oh, the patient is 79 years old or 75 years old, they have mild calcium. At that age, if you're a 75-year-old male with mild calcification, usually that means you're much better than your peers. In other words, you're probably in the 25th percentile among all your peers of the same age and same gender if your calcium is mild when you're already 75 years old. And so some radiologists might feel that if the calcification is so mild, why are we raising a red flag for this particular patient when in fact they're better off than most of their peers? So I think that's one of the reasons for the hesitation, but I don't think that perception is really correct, because when we perform routine calcium scores, we do recommend statins, even if they're 75, even if their calcium is mild, because we base it on these numbers, not on the percentile of the patient relative to their demographic. So I think that's really where the education lies, and where we need to focus more of our work.
Do you think there's it would be helpful to have a public health perspective introduced to radiologists?
Absolutely. I think it has to be emphasized. It was already in many ways clearly described in this publication back in 2018. But I think sometimes it takes a while for literature to disseminate its way to the crowd and to actual practice. And
But this is very clinical. There's other barriers like getting people into a screening program, getting them consistent follow-up, the interaction with cardiology, with pulmonology. Can any of that be brought into the curriculum?
Absolutely. So there are other barriers I think that may be in play here when it comes to recommendations. In other words, if we just describe the coronary calcification as mild, and the referring provider who prescribed the lung cancer screening for the patient happens to be, let's say, a pulmonary medicine physician who may not be too familiar with heart disease and risk factors and management of heart disease, they may not necessarily know that the patient needs to be treated, even though they're 75 years old, is the example that I provided. So part of the hesitancy may be that it's possible that some pulmonary medicine physicians don't want to necessarily refer many or most of their patients to cardiologists for further management, because I think that it's not that common to get referrals that often, especially if you consider the lung screening population. The vast majority of them will probably have a calcium score that's greater than 1. In other words, they'll be in one of these 3 latter categories, which would mean the majority of these lung screening patients would be or should be referred by their pulmonary medicine physicians to a cardiologist, but I don't think that's happening. So definitely that's another layer of education that we can focus on.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matt. And I know there's been some comments in the in the feed that you've prompted, and we'll try to get back to those. But I want to make sure we have time for Mort Nagavi. Mort, could you introduce yourself and give us a view of you're hammering away at I think mostly the FDA, but also CMS.
They're hammering away at him. Would be a better description.
Uh-oh.
Who's the active part? Who's the active party here? Mort, could you?
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for inviting me, Bruce, to your session, and for the organizers. It's great to see you all, friends. We're kind of a club that we keep talking to each other. Hopefully one day we'll just talk to the millions of people who would benefit from what we've been working on for decades. I would say this, we're no longer double or triple. I can guarantee you we have at least 10 in the Swiss Army knife of preventive screening for chest CT. The lowest hanging fruits, of course, coronary calcium and lung nodule. But in the slide that Matt just showed, that category of CAC rags, we've just published several publications this year with David and other team members. That category 0, where we tell people you're low risk, it's not low risk. They have CAC 0, but they have enlarged chambers. And that enlarged chambers lead to stroke, atrial fibrillation, heart failure. So, I mean, that's just become a complete, slam dunk. If we just add AI, and from the same scan that we reported calcium score, we add chambers and report the risk, which we got FDA breakthrough designation for it. And you'll see it here right there behind me. I don't know if I have the Weatherman scale to show you this. So that's one example. You go up, you'll see obviously enlarged aorta and pulmonary artery. Matt knows, an active radiologist here, has value, actionable. So we're talking about actionable. We're not talking about, a bunch of genomic and proteomic data or a ton of things that have no place for actual practitioner to act on. Then right up, there's bone density, which we know has been there, the information for decades. In fact, there is a reimbursement code for it. CPT 77078 for quantitative CT-based bone density reporting, but there has been no use of it. And all these millions of lung cancer screening been done in the last 20, 30 years, or 10 years at least, in calcium score have neglected the information. So I don't mean to go through the whole thing. You can see it behind me. This is sort of our focus to bring it to FDA, to patient care, but that's not going to solve our problem unless we get it reimbursed. And that reimbursement piece has been stuck for calcium scoring for decades now. I personally led a large group of cardiologists, and then later David, Claudia joined, and several other team members. We have had 6 years, 5 hearing. Yesterday, right in the middle of your meeting, I got a bomb dropped on me. In April, they told me, okay, now that you have breakthrough, now all these things, go ahead and resubmit what you submitted January 2019. We will reconsider it. Now, 9 months later, November 14, they send a letter that well, U.S. Preventive Task Force Services still has not recommended, therefore we cannot start the coverage determination process, which is just incredibly frustrating. But I think this could be a blessing in disguise. And here's how. If we as a group build a solid proposal, both to CMS, as part of CMS, I talked to Bruce at a dinner with David and Claudia a couple of weeks ago, to the CMS Innovation Center, where they are presumably open to innovative ideas. And that is, we want to propose a new test, not lung cancer screening, not calcium screening, whatever we call it. Jim calls it chest CT screening, a multi-disease actionable screening, preventive screening platform. What do we need to bring it to you to get it covered? You're already covering a bone density for other things. You're covering lung nodule for a certain population. Bone density is for 65 years and above for female and 70 and above male. Calcium for lung nodule, you're covering smokers with a definition. Here, we have this. We have the data. We've put together a large group of leaders in New York Academy of Medicine in September. Here's our summary of our findings. We want to get started on a new test, just like a medical device drug company comes to you with a new product or new services. That's what I would like if you could spend a few minutes of the collective brain that is here to see what do we need to do. We've also put that in a proposal to ARPA-H that claims to fund moonshot projects. We're fine-tuning our ARPA-H, and this discussion purposely delayed it because we wanted to get some more insight, but we are proposing adding to our proposal that we would like to use this opportunity, this funding, to fill the evidence gap for such an approach, for such a multi-organ, multi-disease preventive screening proposal. So
I would ask the other panelists to comment. You've posed a particular challenge. Cheryl had started out by saying that what you really, really, really need is the public health perspective. Here's what it would be without it. Here's what it would be with it. And Anita has put the challenge out of saying, hey, you need the professional societies, the advocacy groups, along those lines. And I think you and Matt are kind of along the lines of, developing evidence and trying to get standards in place. But I'm wondering if we get to have a little bit of a challenge to what next steps should be along the lines of your request for the collective brain power of the panel.
So Cheryl, what do we need? What do we need to bring to the policymakers?
Well, I mean, I do like the idea of some kind of very well put together public and policy prevention communication. It could be brief, executive summary type brief, that makes the case for this combined screening and lays out the opportunity cost and the upside. When I saw in the chat the questions about ACC and AHA, I mean, speaking directly to the American Cancer Society, which is not maybe the group that's being listed here, but they were very late to the game on lung cancer screening, as the people who were involved in that here know. And so that is part of the problem. And you also have the problem that some of the specialty societies, appear to be operating from a very narrow window. So I'm beginning to wonder whether you want to get different groups on board, like the American Hospital Association, the American Public Health Association, more broad societal, groups. But, I'm not a lobbyist, so that's not my sweet spot, but I definitely think if you can make the case that people are dying unnecessarily every day, that's a very, very, very strong case.
But do we have to generate the evidence in the clinical trial arena?
Well, you
definition
already
that
have
first?
some evidence there. You have some evidence there, but part of the question is really how much undiagnosed latent disease is progressing without any knowledge about it. And there, I'm sure it also involves backing out what routine blood, you have the people who get no health care. So they're clearly, they have a disaster. Then you have the people who get limited health care. And they might get, every other year or so, they'll get a blood withdrawal and someone will say your cholesterol's too high and put them on a statin. So to the extent that that's happening, then that piece that's actionable by the combined screen becomes less of an issue. So I think it is complicated, but I think it could be done, modeled. I mean, I actually think the best person to model this is David Holtgrave. I mean, what you have to do is take the papers that are there and then lay out a set of assumptions, say, here are the assumptions based on the existing literature, and here's our estimate of the number of people slipping through the cracks. I think that's probably already been done for lung cancer screening. If it hasn't, it should be, because
We've done model for calcium score. We couldn't get through CMS. They just don't buy model. They want
Right,
or
that's right.
US Preventive Task Force.
well,
Service.
you're talking about getting it reimbursed, which is critical. I'm not saying that isn't critical, but I also think it's critical for, for there to be, but let's back up. You do have calcium score data from these trials around the world, do you not?
We do not have outcome data that actually group got calcium score. The ones didn't get saved more lives. And unfortunately, the trial that yesterday Jim and David and the other David masterfully interviewed the fellow without releasing the embargo gave me a very depressive mood that the data is not going to look good because the study design by definition was set to fail. They put a very large people that did not get the scan on treatment. I mean, the more you get treated, you're going to have a better outcomes. And so, that's called Cheryl.
Yeah.
I think Anita had a comment.
Yeah, I first want to say, the USPSTF requirements on evidence benchmarks can vary or be different from CMS's requirements. CMS, they don't like modeling. You're absolutely right, Mort. They don't like it, and they will tell you that. Yes, there has to be evidence. Yes, they want to look, the gold standard is an RCT, large domestic RCT is their preference. However, the USPSTF, they do use modeling, CISNET modeling for lung cancer screening. And so that might be an approach if you can show the population-based impact, the magnitude of CAC. Has anyone?
Yeah, we did. Yes, we
has
did.
anyone commented to the USPS?
Yes.
What I
we
mean by
have.
that is
We
there was a
have.
draft recommendation posted in April. I would love to see what those comments reflected that were sent to them. Were there efforts coalition efforts where there were key stakeholders that would be impactful on a combined voice to these entities? It helps shape the implementation when you're able to do that.
So we are running out of time. I think that we've scratched the tip of the iceberg here, but I think the goal of this session was to raise the issue of identifying obstacles ahead of time and not saying we have to wait until we have all of the evidence to move ahead, or all of
Let's conclude that we have the Swiss Army of preventive health screening in action, does provide actionable reports. We are missing the evidence to speak with the bureaucrat of evidence in US Preventive Task Force Services, and we're missing the same for for CMS. So as a group, if we could conclude what to do with it, we're pursuing these two proposals.
I have a somewhat different view. I think the evidence will emerge, but we should not be waiting for the evidence to introduce the concept. and to get broad buy-in of everyone we can on the concept.
Yeah, so for lung
But
cancer
with that,
screening,
without any
we're
evidence.
asking for the community to develop evidence so that we can provide more data and literature to these entities. So, yes.
What about the advocacy organizations? Why aren't they supporting this? I mean, look at the multi-cancer testing. There's no evidence for that. I mean, every advocacy organization is kind of getting on board with
David,
that.
they got $1.2 billion from NIH for 3 trials that are ongoing. Those
So
liquid
if I
biopsy.
could, just to keep us on schedule, I know that that's a radical idea here, but I have a wrap-up slide that might need to modify based on this. I think there's one more slide.
Well, don't give up on Ravinska.
So I
Okay.
that. So I think everyone here should use every opportunity to talk about the multi-screening, to get that idea out there and broadly accepted, whether it's the topic at hand or not. Recognize that evidence is not sufficient, and we because radical new ideas like multi-screening are new. It takes time, so we got to start now. So thank you very much, and Matt, you're up next, so we'll give you a minute to catch your breath.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you.